Hi, and welcome to a Small, Medium, at Large podcast. I'm your host, Gail Heisen, bringing you intimate interviews beyond normal boundaries. I want to thank you for joining us today and for supporting us by subscribing, liking, sharing, and commenting. I want to thank Nancy and Richard for producing and posting this show. We have two guests here today, and we're going to discuss racial trauma. We have Marc Scott with us today and David Levitt. Let me tell you about Marc Scott. Marc Scott is a 78-year-old biracial male who grew up in Brooklyn, New York. After graduating high school, Scott attended college in the Midwest. A year and a half later, he dropped out and joined a hippie commune until he was 36. He developed an addiction to cocaine and found sobriety after the death of two close friends. Marc became a substance abuse counselor after graduating with a BA in psychology and attaining a certification after 500 hours of drug and alcohol treatment education. He developed and ran a recovery home for men for 28 years. 3 years ago, at age 75, he retired, but continues to work with substance abusers on a part-time basis. Marc is also a board member of the Forest Grove Lions Club and a board member of the Engaged Buddhist Alliance, which operates a prison ministry in Southern California. Marc has been a practitioner of Qigong and Tai Chi for over 20 years, and presently he is an instructor as well. Marc Scott, Chris Elcock, and Jay Freedom are currently working on a book entitled St. George Peters, the CIA, the Mafia, and the LSD Rescue Service. This is the story of George Peters, who founded the first harm reduction program during the 60s, the LSD Rescue Service, which offered 24/7 support for distraught drug users, along with a social rehabilitation program geared to returning them to productive roles in the community. David Levitt, my husband, is joining us here today as well, and here is his bio. David Levitt has had a long career as a computer scientist, professor, technology innovator, author, activist, and physicist. Dr. Levitt earned his BS from Yale and his MS and doctorate in artificial intelligence at MIT, where he pioneered the field of AI-generated music. He is CEO of Pantomime Corporation and created the Reality Construction Kit app with uncanny realistic physics. Levitt's family has been active in the civil rights movement throughout his life. David's parents were of West Indian and Russian descent. Their interracial marriage in the 1950s was illegal in 28 states. In the 60s, his parents helped rescue the family of the NAACP's Robert F. Wilson as he escaped racist mobs in North Carolina and fled to Cuba and China. Dr. Levitt, an avid political scientist, learned how democratic politics work when he opposed Dianne Feinstein for U.S. Senator in 2002, earning 76,000 votes. Most recently, Dr. Levitt has developed a simpler way to explain Einstein's theory of gravity using the accelerometers found in ordinary smartphones. He is presented at physics conferences in South Africa and Italy, and he will be a keynote speaker at a gravity conference in Spain next spring. His upcoming book is The Secret Truth About Gravity. So let's welcome Marc and David here today. Welcome, guys. It's great to have you both.
It's great to be here,
Great to
Gail.
be here, Gail.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each question one at a time, one question at a time. And what I would do is have Marc answer first and then David answer next, so that you each take your turn in answering that one question. At the end of the question list, I have a couple questions that would just be geared toward Marc. But other than that, all of these questions would really be for both of you to answer. So I'm going to begin with you, Marc, but this is the same question for you, David. I'd like if each of you could share with us what it was like growing up in your interracial families. Marc?
Okay, so I grew up in a Black neighborhood, Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn, New York. and went to a white school, Brooklyn Friends, which was in Brooklyn Heights, a small private school. And I think the first time that it became, aware of being different was in the first grade or maybe even kindergarten, where the teacher said, we're going to have milk for lunch. We have vanilla and we have chocolate milk. And the kids turned to me and said, I guess you want chocolate milk. And that was my first experience of, oh, I must be different from the rest of the kids. And I came back and talked to my mother about that, and she went on to do an education about different blacks in the culture, and just generally, since my mother was white skinned, even though she was defined as black in the neighborhood she came from because of the during Jim Crow, if you had a known black ancestor, even if your skin was white, you were considered black. But of course, people in the community, in the general community, certainly in the North, where my parents went, my parents met as teachers in a small high school in South Carolina. And because they looked like an interracial couple, they were asked to leave by the Klan, and they fled north
By the
eventually.
Klan?
Yeah, the Ku Klux Klan. They
Oh,
came and talked to him and said, "This you can't be playing this on our
I'm sorry, what city was this?
Sedalia, North Carolina, just outside of Greensboro." And it was a so they decided to leave. They had been warned by the head of the school, Charlotte Hawkins Brown. The school was called Palmer Institute, and Charlotte Hawkins Brown was the director of the school, and they'd been warned that they shouldn't develop a relationship. But they were young and rebellious, and they developed a relationship anyway. And it got out into the community, and the Klan decided, well, we can't have this because it'll give people bad ideas.
Yeah.
So so anyway, oftentimes when I went out with my mother, though, in the community in New York, going shopping or something like that, people would come up and say, "Oh, did you adopt him?"
oh,
Uh, which was another sort of like little dig, and my mother would proudly say, "No, he's all mine," and stuff. But and it was interesting because my mother was much more willing to come to the school for events than my father, who seemed to be kind of hesitant to be around white people in general, even though he worked in the post office, and of course most of the employees were white. But he was very active in the black community, and his warning to me was, when you grow up, the only people that are going to have your back are blacks. And so that was his particular. So I was caught in between, the black community and the white community. And for a long time, I, just ignored any feelings or conflict about it. There was some internal conflict, but, I would push it down and, kind of go away from it. I realized later that um, I kind of ignored my blackness or the black culture in favor of the white culture, um, just because it was the dominant culture and because of going to schools. The grade school, the high school that I went to was one of the three high schools that were college preparatory high schools, even though it was a public high school. It was a college preparatory. David knows it. And I went to Stuyvesant. David went to Bronx Science. And so, most of the schools that I attended, even in college, were, I was one of few black people in the school. When I did drop out and join the hippie movement, the race kind of went away. It was interesting. It's
were you an only child or did you
I
grow up
was an only
with
child. Yeah, my father had an earlier marriage, but my half sister was 20 years older, and I didn't find out until I was in my late 50s, early 60s that I even had a half sister. My cousin blurted it out one day. "Oh, did you know you had a half sister?"
uh,
And I said no, and it turned out that she was close friends to my father's youngest sister, who was 20 years younger than my father, so who was born right around the same time that my half sister was. So they had become friends. But I visited her, and she lived in Washington D.C., and she was just really hurt from my father not being involved in her life. So the visit was very brief, and recently her children have showed up on 23andMe, and I've reached out to them, but they haven't responded. So I think that they still got some resentment going on there.
I have to say, you and I have some of these things in common. I understand that story well, having the same situation in my family. Uh,
Somehow only the cousin tells the truth.
yeah, it's the
Yes,
cousins that you get the
right,
truth from about who's really your cousin, who's really your sister.
exactly.
So David, what was your life growing up? Because as we get older into high school, we have more questions. I have more questions about growing up, but I specifically want to know about just what it was like for you in your interracial family as a child, not later on, but as a child.
Right.
Mark was an only child, and
So I
how
had an older
was
sister,
it?
3 years older, Ramona. Um, my first 5 years, don't remember them that well, of course, but they were in Corona, Queens, which was a mixed neighborhood. And my parents and actually my mother's father had bought a house, a two-family house there. And it was actually, I learned later, it was Louis Armstrong's neighborhood. It was a neighborhood of up and coming blacks and mixed families. I just learned that Satchmo was adopted by a Jewish couple when he was very young, and
Wow.
was given music lessons. And I feel like we're both jazz Hebrews of a sort. But I wasn't that aware of that, and we moved to Roslyn Heights. I didn't know that we had integrated Roslyn Heights, Long Island, uh, in Nassau County, until a little later. My parents explained that it was a distressed property. A couple was getting divorced. My father, by some luck, I guess, went in and negotiated the deal while my mother was in the car. Uh, and my mother talked with the wife of the previous owner. Oh, this is a great neighborhood. Let me help get your daughter into the Girl Scouts. Da da da. But they were flabbergasted because she's from a Jamaican family, and she didn't sound Jamaican. She sounded like a white New Yorker. So when the story is that when we showed up in Roslyn Heights and started unpacking, the seller literally went out like he was in a Norman Lear sitcom and turned to anyone who would listen saying, I didn't know, I didn't know. And the Italian family across the street put up their for sale sign, and people were so worried that my brothers that we would ruin the neighborhood, of course, or not, of course, because of course Black families always would keep their places the nicest, at least in my mother's case, and they actually found that intimidating. And my mother Gail will attest, my mother could be a little intimidating because she was so smart and so stylish. And again, I wasn't aware of this immediately, but as at the end of our time in Roslyn, I realized that she had invited everyone over to her beautiful place. And I think maybe they were a little ashamed that theirs wasn't as nice, and they never invited her over or came back. So I think maybe that was a little lonely. But I was, and you'll find this in my whole life story. I'm a little oblivious and optimistic sometimes, and I wasn't, it's not like my mother said, you're integrating this school, but she tried to look out for me. She tended to be more worried. I think her nightmare after, was that I would take a vacation in the South, like Emmett Till did, and just be my smart ass self and be murdered. So she tried to tell me enough to keep me safe, and but just
And I just want to interrupt here. Both of you grew up in the beginning years going to private school, isn't that correct?
Yes.
Well, I was moved to private school, and let me tell a little of that story because there was a racial aspect. My mother was visiting the elementary school, the first grade in Roslyn Heights, and kind of peered in and looked for me and didn't see me immediately, and waited. And the teacher asked the math problem, and an answer came out of the closet, 7. And she recognized the voice, and she listened a little longer, and another answer, unsolicited, came out of the closet, a correct answer. And my mother's, and she's realizing that these are the only 2 Black kids in Searingtown, elementary school. And she talked to the teacher and said, well, I mean, I think she said it during the class, is my son being educated from inside the closet? and and she said, well, he keeps calling out the answers. And so, but it felt potentially a little racial. She's like, I was the only one in the closet and the only Black student. So she had a problem with this, and she raised it. And they eventually, long story short, well, they said, oh, well, this year is ending soon, meet the 2nd grade teacher. And they wound up skipping me. Or as I like to say, I was thrown out of 1st and 3rd grades. But they wound up skipping me, and the 2nd grade teacher was fantastic. And she said, you may not want to keep him in here for the 3rd grade. And my mother met the 3rd grade teacher, and she said, oh, no problem. I've dealt with pickaninnies before.
My God.
And my mother said, oh my God, I hope we can get a scholarship to that private gifted school we heard about. And fortunately I did. So I went to Sands Point Academy and Country Day School for gifted children for 3 years. And that was, as good as that lady was with pickaninnies, I think that was the better outcome. And although I was, long story short, except in moments like that, I didn't have a big racial confrontation situation. And then after that, in junior high, I was in a school where my mother was a well-known algebra teacher and ultimately the dean. And even bullies were afraid of me without me having to do anything. But there were all these things where people would say, oh, would you like to join Jewish Michael Tenzer on the summer cross country? And my mother was like, oh my God, it's happening. I can't stop it. And fortunately, I guess nothing terrible. I didn't go on that trip, actually.
Well, actually, one of the pluses was I got to meet you in that class in 7th grade.
Yes.
And your mother got to be my algebra teacher, and we got to butt heads together. So it was the beginning of a long-term relationship we didn't know was going to happen.
I had a little crush on Gail when I was 10 and a half, it's true. On the racial trauma thing, I guess it occurs to me, I was going, my best friend, Michael Tenzer, was going on a Native American summer thing. And I was like, gee, that sounds like fun. And I applied. And in the interview, I was a little surprised that they weren't enthusiastic and actually said, don't you want to be in a summer thing about helping people more like you? And I was like, wow, that's some deep ass racism going down there. I guess I won't get to spend this part of the summer with Michael Tenzer. But and as I was thinking about this show, I realized that there are a few racial trauma things that I may be buried because I view myself as largely trauma free. But there are these weird ass things that have happened throughout my entire life, some relatively recently. Anyway.
Okay, so what I want to go back with here, and when I ask Mark this question and then have you answer also, is we're touching on some of the childhood first memories of either interracial or Black trauma, or being referred to with chocolate ice cream. But what I would like to go further into the trauma, and if Mark, you could start off with, that was just the beginning. What things started to happen when you went to Stuyvesant, and when David, you went to Bronx Science, and before you were getting ready to go to college? Did you experience trauma during those years when you were, a teenager, an individual out of the house on your own? Your mother was home, you were out on the street. So whatever you were doing in, I think I remembered the area you grew up in. I don't know if that was back in those days considered a dangerous neighborhood, or whether you were in a safe area, or what that was like for you.
I wanted to backtrack just a little bit. The biggest trauma was in grade school. That was after that incident with the chocolate milk. There were a few times when I got called a nigger by these kids, and so we got into fights. Some of the teachers were just plain mean, and were obviously prejudiced, but not all of them. The principal was a wonderful person of the school, and so by the t but so that kind of sunk in. I mean, there were things like parties that the kids were invited to, and I wasn't invited, and the kids would say, "Well, I'm sorry, you aren't invited," because so and so's mother or dad said, we don't want black kids at the party. And there was, a girl that I really got interested in, and her father, pretty much told her, "Don't be dating him, he's black." There'd be incidents like we did go out on a date a couple of times, and I remember one time with the cab driver. It was raining, and there was a pool of water, on the curb, and the cab driver purposely drove towards where the water was so he would splash us. Um, and when we did get a cab, the cab driver said, "I'll drive you to her house, but you'll have to, take the train uh, from there on." So there were those incidents. But interestingly enough, when I got to high school, that wasn't an issue. There was only one incident with one kid, and it was more of a personality conflict. And we were going to go outside and fight, and he did, called me the N word, but we didn't get into a fight. And then the next time we saw each other, everything was okay. Interestingly enough, he turned out to be a special forces military person, a Ukrainian, and um, had an interesting experience that was written about by one of the writers. But so in high school, there wasn't as much, but by that time, the concept of being black and being different had already congealed, had already been in my system. And so that I had already been, identifying people based on their race and looking at people based on race rather than on their character, and feeling either in place or out of place, or what do I need to do to fit in, or when I wasn't fitting in. And um, oftentimes it would mean that I didn't feel like I fit in both with the white or the black communities at
Mm.
times. So
That would have feel very lonely.
yes.
And both of you, I just want to point out to people who have not grown up in New York like the three of us did, those are two of the top high schools that both of you went to in the city. And you had to have very good scholastic grades to be able to enter into a school like that. And I want to credit your parents for both getting you good educations so that you could go into these particular colleges and excel. And you both, well, we'll continue on with the things you guys did, but you both certainly did excel. So in high school, you found it difficult to date with white girls then as well as when you were younger? Or did you find yourself too busy with academics to bother with dating and that kind of thing?
Well, I didn't have a problem with dating. I was kind of shy, but I think during high school, most of the dates were with girls, mainly black girls or girls who were interracial.
Mm-hmm.
Because particularly when my parents moved to Manhattan, I had to figure out a new circle of friends. And most of the people in the I got involved in the civil rights movement at that time. There was a thing called the SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and I joined the Friends of SNCC, and so I developed a network of people through there. And but most of the girls that I dated during that time were black.
Mm-hmm.
And also I went to Tri Woody, which David knows. And so there were girls that I dated who were both black, and there was a Puerto Rican girl, and there was, so
I thought this was
it
very
was mixed.
interesting. I just have to tell our audience that we had the book release party here at our home for Dr. Stanley Krippner for his memoirs. And this is how we met Marc Scott here at our home, only to discover that both him and David went to the same camp as kids. And I find that it seemed like a very unusual synchronicity to happen this many years later. I don't think you guys were in camp at the same times, but you both actually attended the same camp. And was Tri Woody there was something, uh, I know some other friends whose kids went there as well. And was there something particular about that camp that was different than other camps?
It was a relatively left-leaning community. And by the way,
Yes.
I should say my mom wasn't lonely and isolated in Roslyn Heights. There were families, typically Jewish families, who were part of our circle. The Schachters and Shirley Sandberg and their kids. And some of them went to Tri-Woody, and it was kind of a left-leaning camp. It's funny because, of course, it was, in my case, it was distant enough from the McCarthy era that you could be a little more open about it. But Pete Seeger would sing there he'd visit more than once in the summer, and even Edith Siegel, the dreaded communist, would speak, and people were, and a lot of entertainers kids were there. Jack Guilford's son Sammy and Alan Arkin's kids. It was progressive, mostly Jews, but mixed families, and and it was great fun, and an honor to be there. And that same Michael Tenzer, yeah, it was a well integrated camp with people who were concerned about civil rights and sang songs about it.
Yeah, one experience that we did have was I started going to the camp during the McCarthy era, and there was one year which I couldn't go to the camp because the FBI came to my parents' door and said, "You can't have your son going to that camp because they're left-leaning, basically." So
What
we
business was it of
went.
theirs? What law was broken? Good grief.
Yeah, I think it was 1956, 1957, something in that time. And I remember the agents coming. I mean, it's just like you see in the movie, two tall white guys in and dark black suits, white and black tie, white shirt, coming to the door. They were polite, but they were very, and both my parents worked in civil service activities, so they weren't going to buck that because it would been an immediate loss of job.
Now it's funny because I can't help but think of Gail's experience with the FBI raiding her place while her and her boyfriend were avoiding the draft, but no one was home and they'd already fled to California. And
Yeah. Well, I
uh,
was thinking about when you said that, Gail, that I avoided the draft. I was drafted. I walked out of the induction center. The guy that was there was a short black guy who was kind of like a master sergeant, said, "I'll see you in Leavenworth." And so my
wow,
mother, because I had done a show that Stanley Krippner knows about, CBS had videotaped some people taking acid, and I was one of the people. My mother heard about this and she
whoa,
freaked out. She called the FBI and told them where I was.
ah!
No.
Whoa.
So they came looking for me, and the head of the commune warned me, and that's how I ended up going to Canada.
Oh.
Mm. Canada was the escape plan for your parents' civil rights friends, and for you.
Did you
Yes,
secretly come back, or did you wait for Jimmy Carter to pardon you?
I right around the time that Jimmy Carter pardoned us. Yeah.
I Now the age makes a key difference here. I was born in May 1957, and I believe my 18th birthday was practically the day that the Vietnam War ended.
Ah, yeah.
So, so, so Gail would say my totally unfair luck prevailed one more time.
He was
Well,
just
So
born
in,
with
this, in that sense,
a
I'm
lucky
the youngest
star.
baby boomer.
all the kids in my neighborhood who didn't go to college were drafted.
Mhm.
My
God.
my best friend went over there and had a horrible time and came back and committed suicide, which was sad. I didn't discover that until many years later. He had extreme trauma.
Yeah.
But the other funny thing is that the master sergeant that said that years later, I dealt dope with that guy.
Ah!
So this, now that you're bringing up the question of that is one of the questions I want to ask you here, which is just to Mark, David, it's not you. And that is, did your I see that the positiveness of your involvement with cocaine and drug abuse ended up turning your life around for you to end up doing this to help and serve others for the next 30 years. So that's the positive thing about that. But I want to know, was any of that driving force behind it the fact that you were dealing with racial and interracial and all kinds of confusing things about whether you were living in a white world or a black world? Do you feel any of your drug abuse had anything to do with any of the traumas you were going through?
I definitely had to do with the traumas. I'm not sure if it had to do with the racial trauma. I will get back to that in just a minute. What I was molested as a child,
Mhm.
in the ages of 4 and 6, and my parents didn't. When they found out, they just kicked the person out. My father, it was a dramatic thing, taking a gun, chasing the person out in the middle of the night, a lot of yelling and screaming and stuff, and the guy begging, I don't want, I have no place to go, and my father, saying, "You're lucky I don't shoot you," kind of thing.
That's
But
traumatic.
they didn't have any concept of, the aftermath, and so I went into dealing with depression, suicidal, homicidal ideation for years after that, and had no way of dealing with it, had no coping skills. And even though I tried to reach out to my mom, it wasn't until I was 16 that my mom realized that I needed some professional help, and that was after a suicidal attempt that I made when we were living in the high-rise building. Somebody had jumped off the building a week before, and I decided, oh, that's a good way of getting rid of myself. So I walked out. We were on the 15th floor, so I walked out on the balcony and started climbing out over the balcony. And my dad pulled me back, and my mom realized, oh, well, maybe he does need help. But before that,
I think so.
before that, they just had no concept. And I understand it because I think they grew up with a lot of trauma. And,
Mhm.
in that era was, you just suck it up. Once the trauma is removed, if you're out of the area, if you're out of the trauma, you just suck it up and you just live. The important thing is you have food, a place to stay, and a livelihood, and that's the important stuff. And feelings don't count.
And they were
Uh,
carrying their trauma of also their parents and grandparents. We're
yes.
talking plantation generational trauma. And even though they may not be speaking about it, you as an only child, or you don't even have another sibling to share any of the stuff that's coming from them. You were very lucky that even though he was crazy with the getting rid of the guy and saying, "I'm going to shoot you in the night," he was also showing though how he wanted to protect and care and love you. And that was a good part of that very bad incident. But
But
I
I
think
think
dealing
that
with generational.
what I've seen with in working in treatment is that the people that have the racial trauma, they seem to have a harder time in getting and staying sober.
Mhm.
And I think for me, the blessing was that I did have a good education. And
Mhm.
so that when I did get sober, I was able to navigate the system in order to, support myself in an acceptable way, and deal with things that other people, like I had a case that was outstanding, and I knew that I needed a private attorney. So I went and stood in front of a courthouse and looked for a private attorney. And then luckily I found a person that was working with attorneys, and he found me an attorney that took the case pro bono, and that kept me out of, a 15-year prison sentence.
Well,
Whoa.
So that my educational background, going back to what we talked about late earlier, really kind of advantaged me in that respect. But the other people that I've worked with that didn't have that, uh, um, kind of background or ability to navigate the system, they seem to have had the racial trauma does play into their ability to maintain their sobriety.
and both of you got to grow up in the early years into your teen years or however long with both parents. Neither of you got raised by a single parent when you were born, or where I know in some families only the mother is still there and the father is left. And so you both had some good foundations to deal with all of the interracial things that were going to be coming at you. You
Well, it's
had
funny.
each generation had a better foundation.
Even though my parents fought a lot, which was another part of my trauma.
Oh, well.
And in fact,
You had talked about that in the past, I think, in one of your podcasts. I heard you talking about how your parents would fight, and my parents were that way. Sometimes it got physical. So
my parents did split up when I was 11, but it never felt like a single parent situation because my dad always demanded, partial custody or regular visits, and but yeah, there was that aspect, and I remember, and he was, I realized, speaking of culture, there's so many Black and white cultured men who are constitutionally unable to show affection. It's tragic. I would, as I once, when I was a summer counselor for some Black kids, they were clinging to me because I was just full of love, and they acted like no man had ever hugged them in their whole life.
Probably
and
hadn't.
and I realize it's a part of the Southern Black culture, whatever it is, that I'm so glad I missed. Um, and but it's funny because I was out by the Angel Fountain in Central Park, and my father, who was always very physically demonstrative, um, a stranger, a Black woman, took me aside and said, "You can do better than that." and it took me a minute to realize he thought he was my boyfriend. He thought he was my boy. And I said, "Actually, I can't. He's my dad." But she was trying so hard to be protective, and interracials were so rare at that time that she drew a very logical conclusion.
well,
Did
I remember when I got involved in the hippie movement, people were hugging and stuff, and I wasn't used to it. And I came back to visit my dad, and I went to hug him, and he said, "Take it easy, son."
Let's not go there. That's
Well,
wild.
I have to, my dad, when I flew from New York to San Francisco to come live with him in a pickup truck and live in communes and be hippies here in the early 70s, I got off the plane and he hugged me, and I was 15 and a half, I think, at the time. I've had to remember that hug for the last 50 years. Because, because they were not
Not what
coming
they're
out
like.
very often.
My father, I eventually realized, was very unusual for a guy with a person with a Y chromosome. He was open and affectionate in a way that's not, it was hardly tolerated in the 50s.
Yeah.
I should also mention that my mother was an actress, and something about the way they dealt with the McCarthy era, they knew she was an actress in New York. I'll brag for a second. She was the first Black actress on Broadway who was not playing a servant or a slave in a show Ossie Davis directed called Green Pastures. But she knew blacklisted actors, and she had an activist view of the McCarthy era, and she wasn't going to bend over or bow down or kiss the ring to it, even though she also was very protective, would never refer to herself as a communist or a socialist, never sign any membership list. But it was decades later before I realized I'm what's called a red diaper baby, and that's what places like Tri Woody were all about.
Hmm. Wow.
And in fact, my parents met at an upstate New York left wing place for adult called Camp Unity.
So I think this has given both of you two a step up from other kids who didn't have parents that were political or activists or critical thinkers or educated. And those children had a much, I think, I'm not saying the two of you had an easy life. I'm just saying I think that gave you a step up, an easier approach into education. And I'm wondering, did being Black help you in your, like David, you went to Yale and MIT. Did being Black help you to get into those schools, or were there difficulties, or was it because they were? I'm just wondering how that was for you.
it's funny. A couple of things. Uh, I wasn't a straight A student at Bronx Science. Um, Mr. The, Mr. Camerata, the guidance counselor, was not very supportive when I applied to Yale, and he said you should apply to Colgate, and you know you should have more safety schools, and you know, and I was applying to Harvard and MIT and Yale, and to be, it's funny being interracial in 1973 was just unusual enough, and I was articulate, and I didn't hide it in my resume or my essay, and or you know, and I sure the hell couldn't hide it in my interview. So I think on some level they appreciated the candor and the intelligence behind it, and I think in a weird way it helped. And I was like, you know, I was a little unusual among the Yale applicants, and I was welcomed. Gail, you'll remember. Uh, Many decades later, at the 30th year reunion at Yale, it's staggered so that the class of 77, which I was in, was there with 67 and a few 57 graduates. But I kind of walked over to a group of 67ers, and they looked kind of sepia. They looked, and I was like, were you the black students at Yale in 1957? So, yeah, we knew all of us. There was no more than 6, and this was as dark as you could be at Yale in 1967. And you're right, you had to ask whether I was black because it wasn't even obvious.
As I recall, they were going from graduating class to graduating class to looking for people like you to
They
see
found me,
how
yeah.
it had increased and what had changed since when they had been in school.
They
And
were
after
very
you
curious.
introduced me to them, all I kept saying was, "Are you sure they're black?" You know?
Yeah, they had to convince me, or but that was, you know, Yale was very, you know, Yale didn't even allow women until 1970, but in 1967 there were, you know, they even said we all knew each other except the one guy who pretended we didn't exist. He was only talked to white students or whatever. But and to go back to, you know, in well, even in Bronx Science, there was a social studies teacher, wasn't especially left leaning, didn't mind having provocative conversations, and I come upon this group of people having this very animated, opinionated conversation with um, with a black woman, a student girl, who I found a little intimidating. She had a big afro and a loud voice, and I was not. I noticed, I hardly failed to notice that all the black kids sat together at one table at lunch. And I was like, that seems kind of narrow. Why would I ever do that? I'd love to know these kids better, but I'm never going to do that. Um, and so I come upon this conversation with a social studies teacher and these other people. And I said, what's this about? And they said, oh, we're talking about, is David Levitt black or is he Jewish? And they hadn't invited me into the conversation, but they had strong opinions. And it was years before I realized I had to identify as Nebrew. But they you know, they recognized it as some kind of a conflict, and I was like, well, it's not. I'm sorry that it's weird to you that there are lots of Jews out there who aren't bigots. And uh, and I did feel bad for my sister, because now in junior high, you know, she had apparently the same privileges as me, but I guess it's different for a girl. And she had a crush on Gary Janasic, who reminded her of David McCollum from Man from Uncle. And when he heard her call her a walking, talking Tootsie Roll, she was devastated.
Mm.
And I was very much of a, well, God, you just spent the minimum possible time with a really stupid bigot and can move on. But that's not how she felt.
Oh, yeah, because back then white guys didn't date black girls. It
And
took a
it
long
wasn't even
time,
dating, it was like insulting.
unless they were, you know, artists or musicians or something
Yeah.
like that. That community was different, but in the general community,
And in
uh,
a way, she was rescued by the hippie movement, where race was not a
This race
priority.
was not,
I mean,
yeah,
she was considered the most beautiful hippie that anyone had ever seen.
yeah,
And Gail was in that community too and knew it.
that was experience too. But going back to the what you asked about school, I was a track star in high school, and
Oh,
so my picture got put in the magazine or the paper, the local paper, and they actually took a picture of me in the shop class for some reason. I was probably They probably did that for racial reasons because that had nothing to do with the track. But I got a scholarship to the small Midwestern college because of my track and my involvement both in other activities at the school. I was a B average student, but I was active in other social networks and politically active, and so they kind of like that on my resume.
so I want to go back to trauma a little bit here, if you guys don't mind. And I'm
Oh,
wondering if there, like, were there signs of trauma that you saw inside yourself? Was like there certain behaviors or things that you were feeling inside yourselves that was from this trauma, but you hadn't been able to voice it or connect with it? Or how was that dealing for you, Mark?
Well, the interesting thing is that I didn't realize it until after I retired.
Oh, wow. That's
But it was the anger at not seeing black faces in movies, on TV shows, uh, being suspicious of people. If I moved into a white neighborhood, I was suspicious and always looking around to see if I was going to be accepted. When I traveled with my wife, who was white, I would always be hyper vigilant, checking to see how people were reacting, who was smiling, who wasn't smiling. Um, being those was and misinterpreting the if a person, particularly if a white person, did not smile or looked angry, I would automatically interpret it that they didn't like me because I was black. And those were some of the things that that stand out that I began to realize, and just a general feeling, recognizing that I for a long time I felt more comfortable around certain white people than I did my black people. And actually thinking, negative things about certain people who were black if they acted a certain way. And so I saw that this was all a part of the trauma that I had experienced, um, that slowly kind of seeped in. It's very subtle, and some of it was transferred. My father told me about fighting white kids in school when he was in high school, going to and from school because the kids' parents were in the KKK. And my mother, finding out later that my mother's father was threatened by the Klan because he was assigned to be Postmaster General, and he was told by the Klan that they didn't want him to be Postmaster General. This was in Clark County in Athens, Georgia. He was assigned to that position by President McKinley, and he had been a delegate for McKinley, and the Klan didn't like that, so they told him, you either resign or we're going to lynch you. And so this was stuff that my mother carried that probably transferred on to me without me knowing it, because she didn't really verbalize it. I found out these things later, and it made me understand during the when Martin Luther King was going to do the march from Selma to Montgomery. I wanted to join the march, but I was 18 and I needed to get permission from my mom. And she freaked out. She said, "No way." And I couldn't understand why she was so upset about it. But now looking back on it, she lived through an area where she saw multiple lynchings and the things that went on in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and various other places where black communities were totally wiped out in race riots and stuff. She grew up seeing that. And I remember, at 4 or 5 years old, seeing a Klan march when I visited her, and I thought that,
in
I
North
thought it was
Carolina.
cute. I thought the march was cute. I thought, I coming from Brooklyn, I'm thinking, oh, I hear noise out there. It sounds like a parade, and I want to see the parade. And my aunt freaks out, and she sees me sticking my head looking at the guys in the Klan outfits, and she's pushing my head down and I'm pushing my head up to try to get up there, you know, sort of like that yo-yo type of effect. And then the other remembering the other situation where my cousin around that time took me on a bus, and my cousin's light skinned. She's as light as you are, Gail.
Oh,
And the bus driver says, you can't sit, he can't sit with you. You know, you have to sit in the front, he's got to sit in the back. And you know, a black lady saying, well, come on, honey, come on and sit with me. And so, you
mhm.
know, those things kind of slowly added up so that I pushed them down. But when I got retired, then these memories and these feelings began to come up to the surface. And that whole feeling that, you know, blacks weren't as accomplished as whites, and they, you know, you, there a lot of the accomplishments that blacks did have were suppressed or weren't talked about, and you know, you didn't hear about them. All the credit was given to people with white skin. And so that kind of those kind of feelings about the anger, the disappointment, the feelings of shame began to surface. And it really hit me when I went to a retreat, a qigong retreat, a week retreat, and it just hit me all of a sudden, and I just couldn't stop crying,
Mhm.
recognizing it. And it's interesting because part of me says, well, you never had it as bad as your parents or your grandparents. My grandparents really had it bad in terms of oppression, you know, living in the Jim Crow area, having to be careful, you know, not being able to look at white people in the face, being able to, having to look down at the ground when you walk down the street, having to walk across the street when you saw a white person, you know, being afraid that they, at any time, if they said the wrong thing or did the wrong thing, they could be lynched. I didn't grow up that way, but you hear about it regularly over and over again. You know, particularly that time when Emmett Till you talked about, when that happened, that was really a big shock in among my friends in the Black community. You know, one of the other saving graces I think that my mom did was that she joined me to a thing called the Jack and Jills, which was a club for the blacks in the community to try to keep them out of gangs and keep them away from. So that a lot of the kids parents came from the similar background as my parents did. And so we hung out and related to each other and kind of formed a protective social network. But, you know, it was there. It was talked about regularly about, you know, you got to be careful about this, be careful about that. These are certain areas you can't, even in particularly in Brooklyn, there were certain areas you were told you can't go into if you're black. You're going to get your ass kicked or possibly killed. And
You mean saying
if
white
you,
areas of Brooklyn?
yeah, yeah, Canarsie was one of those areas.
And I guess Staten Island might be famous for that New York racists.
And I remember there were some stabbings of interracial couples in the village during that time,
Mm.
particularly around the Italian areas.
Hmm.
So I think that's where it really hit me when I retired, and those feelings came up, and the mixed feelings of seeing, you know, that not only did I have the shame about being black, but you know, I had my own prejudice. You know, eventually it comes out that you get prejudice towards. I remember I was in a dream group, and I was telling the dream that this white kid that looked in the dream, this white kid was on a stoop looking at me, and I described what he looked like. And one of the people in the dream group, we share each other the dreams, and that we give feedback to each other. And the guy said, "Well, you know, sounds like you're prejudiced," and it that really struck me. I said, "Well, yeah, probably am." You know, probably do automatically put people who look a certain way in a category that they're, you know, that they are haters
Mhm.
towards blacks, which may or may not be true. Because since then, one of the things that happened to my wife and I, we had watched a movie many years ago in which there was a serial killer, and we're going along hiking someplace, and we get lost. And this guy comes up to us and asks us if he can help. And he looked exactly like the serial killer in the movie. And we're walking behind him, and the guy's got a buck knife. And we're walking behind him and thinking, oh my God, this guy is going to take us down the garden path and cut us up, and we're doomed. But he led us to where, we could find our car, turned around and hugged both of us.
Oh,
Wow.
And that really showed me that I've got this misinterpretation. I look, there are certain people, they look a certain way, mainly if they're white, and I automatically am interpreting them without knowing them because of this
Hey,
trauma.
when you were treating, because your resume is very impressive. I didn't read it on our description, but you've done so much work in hospitals and special rehabilitation, addiction places that are set up. Did you find that you were treating a lot of people in the Black community there, or were you working mostly with white people, or was it a similar, both the same thing, or how did that affect you?
Yeah, it was both.
It was both.
And the thing I've realized now that I think we cheat the Black community by not addressing the racial trauma. I think it's just being talked about now in the Black community. I did a search on YouTube, and there are very few talks about it, and very few talks about how to heal from it. And a lot of the people that I know in the Black community, they don't even want to acknowledge it. And if they do acknowledge it, it's sort of like uh, a badge of courage, so to speak. I've been oppressed, and I've got this going on, and I'm a survivor, and they don't think that this is a trauma just like any trauma, and that you can heal from it. And
Until we saw that series Tulsa, or the one about the affluent Black community in Oklahoma, there's nowhere in history or school or anything that I remember ever hearing that. When I saw that, I said, wait a minute, there were I was shocked. I mean, I was
yeah,
happy to hear that such a thing existed, very unhappy to hear what happened to them and the manipulations with the white man and the ranchers and all this. But this was true history that I would have never known anything about had this movie not come forth like that.
well,
and
there's a
that was
couple
only one of a few communities that happened to. That was only one of 5 or 6 different communities.
wiped
Well,
out. Right, there was the Underground Railroad movie, which ends with whites wiping out a Black winery community that had established itself. It's rather unexpected. They escape, but they haven't really escaped in the end.
Mhm.
And many people learned about Tulsa first in Watchmen, which was based on a comic book. It's like the
Ah,
only way you could find out what really happened to an entire upper middle class Black town was to read
ah,
the comic book and see the movie based on it. Directed by Regina Hill, was it? But and co-starring Lou Gossett, and he has memories of this. But they have been wiped out from the public record, or they had been. A lot of them came back after George Floyd, and people were like,
mhm.
"Holy smoke! This has been hidden from us our entire lives."
Right, right.
so
And you never heard how many slave revolts there were, in school. It was almost like the slaves just put up with it, and they were uh, they were sheep, so to speak. There were hundreds of slave revolts, and part of the reason the miscegenation laws came about, according to after reading Lewis Scott Jr., was that the white servants, that indentured servants, and the Blacks got along
Mm.
before the 1700s, between 15, 16, 1700s. They got along with each other, and some of them revolted against the system. And there was a fear that if you allowed them continue getting along, they were going to destroy the uh, the slave plantation system. And you didn't that was never talked about in school.
In
did
terms of,
both
in
of
term,
you were your backgrounds, can you trace, like David or Mark, do you trace your backgrounds back to plantation slavery here in the United States? Or David,
Both
did you
sides.
go back to, I think you had a different history of how your family came to the United States.
I was lucky in a way. It's very a privilege to be an immigrant, and and it's much worse to be baggage or shipped goods.
It's property.
So when we came, when my my mother's father worked on the Panama Canal, and that helped earn him citizenship. I mean, that was a hard project, and he was the toughest guy. And he brought his family to Ellis Island, where my father's Jewish parents and your four grandparents all came. But they had, in that cultural and economic sense, more in common with those immigrants than they did with freed black slaves and their descendants. Um, and in all sorts of ways. It's often never spoken of, but Mark and I don't talk like black people. And I've had the experience where someone I recently met for the first time in person was trying to articulate something that he was very embarrassed about, or a little embarrassed about, and didn't know how to say it. And finally said, I felt a little funny being sure you were Jewish on the phone and finding out you were black in person.
Well, the name David Alex Levitt,
Doesn't
you
help.
expect a little
You didn't
Jewish
let
man to
on.
show up.
And my mother, and this was maybe one of the bigger traumas for me to hear about. Again, she didn't rub it in, but I eventually learned that part of how she got degrees, I mean, she was a freaking genius beyond being a Broadway actress. She had degrees in math and chemistry, which I used to joke must have made her feel secure at auditions. But she had, on some level, the best resume you could have, and she got a job offer as a chemist on the phone. And the guy was so proud and confided in her that he was going to overrule any of the other chemists who didn't think it was appropriate for a woman to be a chemist. And he was going to make his feminine. Well, there was no word feminism back in the 50s, but so he gave her the job on the spot over the phone, and she showed up for her first day. And she watched as every other person came in and out of that office until after 5, and this very embarrassed secretary said, I'm sorry, he's left for the day. And she had seen people peering out of the office, seeing that she was black, and they didn't even have the guts to tell her that for that reason she had lost the job that she had been offered earlier in the morning. And that was going to be her career if she didn't say, I'm not a chemist, I'm a public school teacher.
And how about your family, Mark? Can you trace your roots back?
Yeah, I know the plantation my mother's family came from.
Mhm.
And we're trying to figure out who the parents may have been, the male parent. And my father's parents were both raised on plantations. My grandmother, his mother was raised on a reservation, but it turned out that the Cherokees took slaves. And so there wasn't an intermarriage. She was actually probably raised as a slave on the reservation.
Wow.
And
Never
my
heard of that.
I never heard anything about that.
Never heard anything like that.
yeah, the five civilized tribes on the East Coast, three of them took slaves. So it
Which
was the
tribes were
Cherokee.
those?
I think it was the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Seminole, and I'd have to look at the other two. I'll look, but and my my grandfather, my father's father, was a slave somewhere in South Carolina, but we haven't located the plantation yet. Was planning to go back to the museum, the National Museum uh, in Washington, D.C., and do some work It's the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole.
And they took black people
They
to be
took slaves,
slaves.
yeah.
Wow. Now I've
There's
never seen that
I
in
think,
any movie or history.
right. The Seminole stopped doing it and became a refuge, place for slaves to escape. And I think I'm not sure whether it was the Creek, I think, did the same thing. And so three of them worked on fought with the Confederacy, and two of them fought with the Union.
And David, didn't somebody get owned by some? Don't you have a little history?
so I eventually learned. So I never met my mother's mother. She died young, but she was relatively light skinned. My mother was one of the darker children, Wilhelmina, and it turned out that Wilhelmina, her grandfather, had owned her grandmother in the West Indies, and that I'm 17 30 white. And darn it, if when I did 23andMe, that's exactly what it said. And but the West Indies and Jamaica gave up, and Barbados gave up slavery before the American Civil War, and had a much more humane view of interracials.
Thanks to the British.
The British, and they could even inherit land and could even be treated with respect. And so that my mother carried that culture with her rather than a slave culture, and I think it was a huge, it's basically an immigrant culture. And I wanted to say one other thing about hidden history because it's so well hidden.
Mhm.
And what's his name? Tom Hartman wrote a wonderful article about where the Second Amendment really comes from. And Clarence Thomas was an affirmative action hire, and he's a complete idiot, especially about civil rights. He was replacing Thurgood Marshall because he reflected so little light, but it was also true of his brain. And so it turns out, so he gave an incorrect analysis of the Second Amendment. The truth about it that white Tom Hartman's article points out is that it's unlike all the other amendments. It really doesn't belong in the Constitution anymore. Unlike all the other amendments, it's a federal thing. It mentions states, and it mentions state militias. And it turns out that James Madison had been arguing at length with Southerners who did not want to join the United States unless it was clear that they could go to other states with their militias, which is why that word is used, and state militias, and reclaim their escaped property.
Mm-hmm.
And do it armed.
Yeah.
That's where the right to bear arms comes from, the ability to go to another state in the Union and capture slaves. They didn't phrase it that way because it would have been too horribly embarrassing. That's exactly what it's about. And if you look at Madison and their arguments, it's 100% crystal clear. And it's completely hidden that the reason we have a giant gun violence epidemic is because we're holding on to an amendment that's all about enforcing Black servitude.
Mm-hmm.
And should have been canceled in 1866.
Put up the Fugitive Slave Act. Yeah.
Yes, closely related. Yes, and but they won't talk about it, and they pretend that it's about the big pretense is that it's about having an unfair government and being able to rise up against it with your own guns.
Yeah.
No, it's about catching niggers. And if people were explained that, then the Second Amendment would be long gone.
Yeah.
And the gun epidemic would be over instead of huge in our culture. Anyway.
Gentlemen, I have 3 more questions on my list here for you, and we're about at an hour and 10 minutes into our show.
Wow.
And I feel they're important questions, so I'd like to bring this particular one specifically to Marc, and then the other 2 questions I have left are for both of you. And I hope that I'm managing this right, this
I'm
interview
having a ball.
people at the same time. I haven't done a lot of this, so I'm trying my best.
Yeah, well, you're doing good. It's an experiment.
Oh, good. It's an experiment. I hope our listeners are enjoying it as much as I am. Marc, what insights and cognitive techniques did you develop for yourself to overcome the trauma and to heal? And
Well, the
maybe
first
this
thing
is
I want to say
something
is that
that
I'm
could help
working on
others.
overcoming the trauma. But some of
Mhm.
the things that came up was going back to what David said about the Caribbean versus Southern blacks. I remember an incident that happened in my church in which the pastor, who was a very active civil rights minister, had done a beautiful speech about the Sermon on the Mount and compassion for others and stuff. And shortly after that, one of the kids in the church, who was a fighter, a test pilot, um, his plane exploded and he died. And his family was from the Caribbean. We used to say West Indies, but I got corrected and said it's not West Indies. That's an American thing. It's Caribbean.
I never
And
realized I was misspeaking. Thank you.
so there were people in the church, Southern blacks who immigrated, who were upset and said he's not really one of us, and we don't want the sermon in the church. And it just shocked the shit out of me. It shocked my parents also. But that's one of the things that I remembered, and seeing that racism or prejudice can happen inter-race. The other thing that dawned on me is that when you look at World War I and World War II, those are people of the same race killing each other. They weren't any nicer to each other than this is, a lot of black friends who say the white people do this, white people do this against us. They did it to each other, the same thing.
And
And
obviously Jews aren't immune to genocide.
right.
Committing
And
it.
going to Wilkerson's the Caste book, Isabel Wilkerson's book, she points out that there are people, and I like history. One of the things that I really liked in high school was history, and then same in college, and I've read it since then. Every country throughout the world has got some group that gets picked on by some other group.
Mhm.
And so I began to see, well, don't take this personally. Yeah, you got oppressed because of the color of your skin, but a lot of people get oppressed for various reasons, whether it's skin or ethnicity or nationality or religion or whatever. And so, and then the next thing I realized that in the United States particularly, it wasn't the same as it was in Germany during the Holocaust. I mean, there was oppression, but there wasn't the idea that we're going to wipe you out altogether. And the civil rights movement couldn't have happened unless there was a significant number of white people that were willing to see it happen, that said, hey, this is ridiculous. We don't want to put up with this stuff in this particular country. This isn't okay. And so it had to get over that concept of this is white and black issue. This is more of a people issue. There's some people that are just jerks, and and
I love
they're
that.
into money, property, and prestige. And in order to get that, they'll do whatever they need to do in order to get it. The other thing that when we were on our road trip, we one of the nice things we did was look at the Underground Railroad places, different cities. We stopped in Syracuse and
Wow.
the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and various other places, Greensboro. And I picked up a book about the Underground Railroad and stuff, and about slavery in general. And in the book, whoops, I just hit something that, yeah, in one of the books that I was reading, it pointed out that um, even though England had uh, stopped slavery much earlier than the U.S., there was a movement to help former slaves move into Liberia that came not only from England, it came from the US. Well, the interesting thing is the people who moved to Liberia were better um, educated in the Industrial Revolution or technology. And so they dominated the indigenous population that was there, that was Black. And they ended up doing similar things to that population
Oh,
that they complained that the whites had done to them, and which led to the civil war that happened in Liberia, and I think it was in '60s or '70s. There was a major civil war, which was the uprising of the indigenous population that had been there historically against the blacks that had moved there from the U.S. and from England. And so that said to me, oh, okay, this is a people thing. It is
Right,
really isn't a
sure.
race. Race is just a smokescreen. It's really more about how people, some people get into power, and like Stanley was talking about the other day, power corrupts, you know, and ultimate more power makes ultimate corruption. And some people just like to dominate, and they don't care what's going on with the other people, and and so those were some insights that, and then that made me realize that you've got to step out of this. Another incident that was really interesting is when I was in Canada, and I'm running this homeless program for runaways and draft dodgers and deserters. Some kid had been, the cops were after him, and he had been in the place and left, and the cops came looking for him. And this one cop said, have you seen him? And I said, no. And the way I answered pissed him off. And he said, oh, you spear chucker. And I cracked up because I'd never heard it before. He was, to him, spear chucker was the same thing as nigger. But I'd never heard spear chucker. It was the funniest thing. I was just standing up there cracking up, and he's looking shocked and stuff like that. And it dawned on me, I don't have to buy into the word. It's just a word. It's
I
a word
love
that
that
has
story.
connotation.
Yes.
And so all of those things put together said, okay, you've got to look for how you can transcend this trauma and let it go. And then the last thing that happened in uh, the workshop that I talked about earlier, the Qigong retreat, we were talking about one of the leaders of the retreat was talking about forgiveness, and he was talking about trauma just in general. And he said, the thing you've got to do is you've got to work on forgiving the cause of the trauma, the person or the group or whatever it is, and because you've got to let it go, because otherwise it holds on to you. If you keep and I think the one I saw, the woman Donna Rebido,
Yes.
yeah, she talked about that.
Hmm.
She said, if you hold on to the resentment, that it traps you. And so you've got to work on forgiveness. And so I've been working on that and looking at the people that developed this construct of racism and working on forgiving them and looking at going back to Christianity, the concept that Christ said, forgive them, Lord, for they know not what they do. Because when they're hurting other people, they're hurting themselves without them realizing it.
I totally agree. Although there is this aspect of that's much harder to do if there's no justice. And getting past, it's like saying, forgive this guy who's never apologized. That doesn't work. It has to be a circle.
Well,
Well, I
you
don't think you're
don't
understanding the forgiveness idea.
you have to understand what I'm understanding is that you have to realize that these are sick people
Hmm.
and they're hurting themselves and they don't know it. And
But
so
if they're powerful people, it's
in the long
worse.
run, they're kind of worse off than the person that's been hurt, because the person that's been hurt knows it and they know where it came from.
Right. You're so far above the spear chucker guy. But when racists are in power, it's a different dynamic. I'm not into saying, "Oh, never don't." There doesn't have to be any justice. I forgive you.
I
That's
just
other
want to
Well,
people.
say I'm very glad for everything that you just said, Mark,
Yeah.
because first of all, it soothes over my feelings of thinking about Native American people taking slaves. And it also makes me think of these other things. Um, my dad used to say that the way the Israelis behave, it's as if they were reincarnated from Nazis. And that it seems like that it's like it reverses itself. And then this whole karmic thing happens in another lifetime. And people that were treated a certain way are now getting that type of treatment themselves, or they experience the different pains and traumas that was inflicted from their generation. and then all of a sudden they're experiencing it coming back to them, and they're wondering why this is happening to them. It seems like a cycle of this for eons of time, back as far as history is. There was always somebody that's the underdog and somebody else that's rising to the top.
Well,
But it's not
that
random.
brings up another thought that I just wanted to respond to something you said, David. There may not be justice in our lifetime, but if we believe in spirituality, there's justice for that person. That
If we
person
believe in
pays for it
activism, it
on
can be.
another level.
I understand that, and as King said, the arc of justice is long, but it gets longer if you say, "Oh, we don't have to fight; we just have to forgive." Um, the truth is, Israelis and Jews can be great, but Zionists are Jewish supremacists, and unless they're called out as being Jewish versions of white supremacists oppressing people who aren't in the privileged class, apartheid will be permanent, and genocide will be permanent. We can't let it slide and say, "Oh, forgive them; they know not what they do." We have to say, it's interesting. This just came up. At a Harris event, a bunch of Jewish and other activists stood up and said and tried to fight against genocide. And she said, "You want Trump? You better not. You better let me speak." And said, but they affected her. And the next time that a bunch of people, just a few days later, spoke up, she said something much more empathic and compassionate. And you realize that her campaign is being shaped by the people who don't tolerate who are against genocide. God, who thought that some unknown minority of Jews is against genocide? But they have to speak up, and they actually affect things when they do. And when they hide or when they're silent, they're complicit. So I'm saying we might forgive them. We better not be silent, and we better not be complicit in genocide and things like that.
Right,
I
I agree
want
with that.
I
But I
want to
wanted
say,
to go back to what you said, Gail. One of the other thought that I recognize is that um, all of our ancestors were dark skinned.
Right.
The light skin didn't happen until about 10 to 15,000 years ago. So, in effect, one of the things that I joke with some friends about is that white people are just light skinned blacks. And
Like your mom.
but
That's right. You have
but
an extreme case
but
of
the
Gail.
other thing that I thought was that what do you think happened to people, because the transition between darker skin to light skin must have happened very slowly over generations. How do you think the people were treated who were lighter skinned in a darker skinned culture when that transition was happening?
mhm.
I think gingers probably get a little bit of it. In other words, someone who's red-haired and fair skinned, they probably said, "Yeah, go get yourself some sunscreen, ass."
So I have two questions left, which you've answered part of. So it's always like I feel like my questions get answered, and I didn't even get to begin to ask you the question, but I'm going to say it anyway, and you could add to it anything either of you want to say. And I'm going to read both questions at once here, which was, are racial norms changing now? And what positive things, if any, can we say about the current situations going on today in regards to racial injustice? And
Well,
that's my first questions.
I see racial norms changing. I mean, my wife and I took a road trip from Niagara Falls down to Miami. And when we got below the Mason-Dixon line, I was ready to have a fight, and nothing happened. So it was like I'm all dressed up to go out to a party and no place to go.
A black man with an Asian wife or whitish wife.
So that's
So
a change.
That's
that's a
great.
change. That's
Yes,
a
I've been
major change.
afraid to do that with David, to go to the South.
And I mean, there wasn't even a hint of myth. Now, of course, we were in major cities, and they were the smallest town, I think, was Greensboro or Sedalia, but nothing, no harsh looks, no words said, no honks, no
Isn't that the same city, Sedalia, where you were when you saw the Ku Klux Klan coming through?
Athens. Athens was the city.
Athens.
We went to Athens. I
And
visited because everything was cool.
That's factual change.
That's factual change.
That's
And
And
wonderful to
and
hear.
and the other thing, you know, now I can turn on the TV, ads and movies and stuff, and you see black people much more than in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. You never saw a black person, maybe
and not just
once.
black people, but interracials.
Interracial. Thank
And
you.
that was absolutely forbidden. My mother loved, not loved, but she would say, you know, if South Pacific came on, she would say, oh, hints of an interracial love. One of those characters will be dead before the end of this movie. And and she was never wrong, you know, until the 70s.
Right.
And when Kirk kissed Uhura, it didn't matter that aliens were forcing him to do it, and NBC had to pull those episodes from the South, so into the late 60s, and you know, from syndication, because it was too much trouble. Now I had this, there there's well, I think there's the joy. There's something joyous and wonderful about the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter movement, because it may seem so redundant and obvious, but it really, we needed something much less distant than the 60s and Dr. King to say, yes, we're standing up for this. White people are standing up for this. This change has happened, and it's going to happen. But
Mm-hmm.
last night I tried to record it. It's a HelloFresh make your own meals at home ad,
Yes.
but it's so here's a black woman, really beautifully dressed, very upper middle class looking, and she's being served by this white maitre d' waiter. So can I get anything else for you? And they pull back a little, and suddenly he's sitting down at the table, and it's her husband, her white husband. So there's so many things getting turned around to make
Mm-hmm.
a white supremacist crap their pants, because
Right.
he's serving her, and then he says, and you realize that they're in their own living room, and he's saying, oh, have you checked the laundry? And she gives him a look like, well, if it needs to be checked, you're doing it. And she's the
Right.
person being served, and the family is interracial, and it's cool with everybody, and it's normal, and it's a way to sell products, and we're selling them because there's so many interracial families or non-bigoted families that it's better for our business model to have ads like this. And it's just like, yes, 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 go HelloFresh. You know,
And of course, there is a backlash in some of the southern states. You know, they're trying to pull things that tell the truth about various things, and it's not just black issues; it's a variety of issues. You know,
it's
I
definitely,
think,
it's definitely, you know, it's definitely, you can't get a straight story about how many Palestinians are dead, even from MSNBC's supposedly left. You have to watch Democracy Now, where genocide is barely is a lie, and when in fact they're going on TV saying, "I wish we could kill all of them."
well, but the other thing that was interesting when you talked to this woman Gina Waldman, nobody has talked about all the Jews in North Africa and how they were persecuted. Nobody has talked about that. That was a complete shock to me that half of Israel is composed of Jews that came from North Africa, not from Europe.
And I think they experience prejudice, and they're discouraged from coming there by some Israelis.
Yes, well, the Ethiopians were.
Yes.
Yeah,
So yeah, that's a whole complicated ongoing thing.
that's a whole complicated ongoing
But
thing.
it's turning beautiful in a very public way in a lot of places, and yet you're saying, oh, guess, you know, people are getting to think it through. Jewish supremacists and their Jim Crow apartheid. You know, it's sad for me as someone who's, my parents said, you know, when you talked about a community of people like you, we had a very small one. Elaine Jones, the timpanist who married a Jewish doctor, and her son Thoth, who was actually a brilliant musician who had a documentary made about him that won an Oscar, and his mixed sisters, and me and my mixed sister. And when bigots would say, "Oh no, what will your," they didn't say mongrel, but what will your freakish children do? They won't even be able to get married. They would laugh and say, "Oh, David will marry Harriet and Stephen will marry Ramona. It's all
Yeah.
taken care of." So we weren't victims of bigots, but we had a small community of non-racist Jews and blacks and mixed families that supported each other.
You were very lucky.
Yeah, yeah, you were very lucky because I remember years ago I was with a friend's party and there was a Jewish couple there and they were complaining about their daughter dating a black guy. And I said, well, what's wrong with that? And they said, well, you know, the cultural difference. And I said, well, would it have been okay if he was Jewish? And they looked at me shocked, like, how could that be? As if a lot of the Jews in the East thought of Jewish as white. They never thought of you could be a black Jew.
Right. That's, yeah, that still doesn't compute for most people. I love that even in this week, there's a former president saying, wait a minute, you can't be both black and South Asian. That's the mathematical impossibility.
Yeah, right.
He's
Yeah.
trying a trick on all of us. And I just think
Uh,
so fresh.
so, gentlemen, I'm enjoying our talk so much, but this is at the point where I give you each whatever amount of time you need to share any words of wisdom or anything else you'd like to share with our listeners about our show today, and anything that you want to point them towards. If you think there's a website or a book or anything you'd like to say about that, so that they can maybe pursue more of this information on another platform, or anything you might have to add. So I'm going to start with you, Marc, first, and then we'll finish with you, David, and then we'll close the show out.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for doing this. Your shows are just wonderful. I've watched at least 10 or 15 of them, and I enjoy them each time, and I've learned a lot from them. And I appreciate you doing this with this show, getting a chance to give me a voice, to give us a voice about this particular issue. And the point that I would make for any listeners is that racial trauma is a trauma, and it doesn't have to stay that way. You can heal from the trauma. You don't have to stay with it to live with it for the rest of your life. And I one of the YouTube things I saw on healing from racial trauma was done by a woman called Lisa Collins on TEDx Carioba, and she said that she found a technique called STAR, Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, as successful for her to overcome her particular racial trauma.
Thank you. And thank you for being a guest and also bringing this topic to our show. I'm really excited that we've gotten to have both of you at the same time. So thank you, Marc. I appreciate you, and I also appreciate all the wonderful people you've been telling me about. And thank you so much for listening to a Small, Medium, at Large podcast. And David, is there something you'd like to say?
Um, Let me try and give the shortest possible description of a relevant story. Um, because it connects with the international thing, but also with the civil rights movement. So, I'll Freedom Summer, 1965, North Carolina. My parents, my parents viewed it from a distance at that time, but there was a very well-known NAACP activist named Robert F. Williams, who was looking forward to Freedom Summer's buses coming through North Carolina. Many of the Klan and the sheriffs were not. They tried to kill him. He escaped with help from a white family. The next day, he learned that he was being sought for arrest for having kidnapped the white family. This was not the case, but he was still in fear for his life. He vanished. No one knew where he went, but he found somewhere safe to go. And suddenly there was this high wattage radio station broadcasting from the southern United States up to Canada, playing Nina Simone and Dick Gregory and Malcolm X and Dr. King. And it called itself Radio Free Dixie. And when they tried to figure out where it was broadcasting from so they could lynch that person, it was coming out of Havana. Oh. Havana, Cuba, which was our ally in the civil rights movement, unlike any of the Southern governors and sheriffs. So, cut to, this is really about putting Cuba and China in the right place in the civil rights movement in a way. I'm in China with my mom, who long before long before anybody but Nixon had been to China, was teaching English there, and viewed Chinese not as people to demonize or fear or, oh no, they made a better technology than us, but as our allies in world in fighting poverty and having medicine for all, and things that Americans frankly still struggling with. And she's teaching English there, and I managed to visit her there, and a guy, and I hear Milroy, that's her name, coming down a long hallway in some government building in China. And this big guy comes down this long hallway and gives my mother the biggest embrace and says, "Thank you for rescuing my children."
Oh,
And I have no idea what he's talking about. Turns out that when he vanished to Cuba and then was invited to China by Mao Zedong, who respected American civil rights leaders, um, he didn't have his family with them. And Milroy and Danny Levitt took their Rambler to Ottawa with two kids in the back that they said were David and Ramoni, but were actually Robert Williams' kids.
oh.
And he got and they committed, I don't know how many felonies to get them out of the country into the safety of their family. And no one knows it. Someday I'll add it to Wikipedia. But when you see Cuba being demonized, and how many 70 years we've struggled to destroy that country with sanctions and a blockade, it's longer blockade than and when we see China being demonized, this is actually part of this racist project that we're someday going to successfully defeat. And China and Cuba are both our allies in this project, and shouldn't be treated as anything else. That's my little tidbit. And I'm just glad to be at this time when all of that is ending and we can participate in the end of it.
Thank you for sharing such very wonderful stories and sharing some of the intimate things that happened in both of your lives. I want to thank all of you for joining us today on a Small, Medium, at Large podcast. You know, you can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and all other social media sites. Stick with us for more interesting shows, and we look forward to having you again. Remember, share your stories because we know stories can heal. Have a wonderful week. Bye.
Thank you, Gail.
Bye,
This is
Gail.
fantastic.
Thank you, guys. You've been wonderful.
Thank you.